Susie Bland, and I'm going to welcome you here on behalf of the High Point Historical Society. We really have a good speaker today. Richard Eller is a historian, and he's a professor at Catawba Valley Community College. He's written books on the Piedmont Airlines, the polio epidemic of 1944, and has written this book, because I had to write down, Industry in the Wood, The History of Furniture in Western North Carolina, which is kind of what he's going to talk to us about today. But I think it's really going to be a great presentation. Marion saw him earlier, said he is a great presenter, so thank you for coming. And next month will be May 15th, and will be preservation in North Carolina, High Point area.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Oh yeah, I got this one too. All right, I just got to talk to my left side. So, I very much appreciate the opportunity to come. I love this museum you guys have done. I mean, this is really, I got to get the Catawba County people down here to look at it. Thank you for being here. I'd like to say hello to my furniture cousins, because always in writing this book, High Point has played a kind of a ghost role in it. Because when people think of the furniture industry in North Carolina, are they thinking of Lenore? No, they're not. They're thinking of High Point. And I have, there are really two reasons that I wrote this book. As a historian, I wanted to find out some things that I did not know. And as we all do, since we're history people, it kind of drives us, right? But the two things were, if you look at William Stevens' book on J.E. Broyhill, he points out that there was really a furniture figure 8 in North Carolina. And it's like this. And you've got your eastern end, or the ones on the right, which is you guys, High Point, Lexington, Thomasville, all that. And on the western end is Morganton, Lenore, and Hickory, with Statesville being at that piece in the middle. That was my first thing that said, that explains why there's this divide. I mean, we are related, but we aren't exactly the same. And the second point was, I was leading a book club on county history that Leroy Ladle, who unfortunately just left us back in February, a pioneer in furniture retailing, said, you know, the story of the western side of it has never really been told, and you could do it, pointing at me. And so back in 2019, I said, yeah, okay, let me take that on, but I need your help. And since he was so formative in terms of many things that went on with furniture retailing, he knew all the manufacturers. He also knew some of the really good stories. So I began to interview him, and we, on the way, did a book on his business views, on Hickory Furniture Mart, on a house that he owned that you'll probably see coming up. Let me get this thing started because I go through, this thing keeps me online. You know how us history people love to get off on tangents? Guilty. So I'm going to try to keep this in line with some of what you see in the book, but I do have copies of it here if you're interested after we're done. That's the figure, the furniture figure 8 there. And I began to concentrate on this area, mainly because I grew up with that. Born in Lenore, grew up partially in Winston-Salem, but we moved back to Lenore when I was a teenager. My first job was in it was at the level of my intellectual capacity at the time, which was loading trucks. And so I understood what shop traffic meant at 4:30, how busy that was going to be, and all those sort of things. And I understood the culture of the family. I was down in your furniture exhibit, and they were talking about furniture being a family, and I can relate to that because I spent a lot of time there as a kid trying to figure out, you know, what I was going to do in life and earning money, you know, throwing dressers up on top of chests and all that sort of thing. But the furniture industry was always an interest. I always had some tie to it. Both my parents had connections to the furniture industry as well. And so I wanted to tell that story. Now, where I went here with this is I went back to the beginning, because how do we know where furniture began? Well, it began with mankind because mankind needed something to sit on. And if you think about furniture, it is so ubiquitous. Everything that for a lot of people, it's second only to their home, the investment inside that home that they make in furniture. And so I started going back all the way to the cabinet makers, because like High Point, Hickory, and 200 years ago was pioneer territory, and they were making it for themselves. As things went on, they began, the more prosperous began to import furniture from England, from France, but they also hired cabinet makers to do it for them. Thus, we began an industry. A proto-industry, yes, but an industry of cabinet makers in our area who were joiners, were sawyers, carpenters. Some of them lived at the place where they made furniture. Some of them made furniture so big that you couldn't get it out of the house. So it's always going to stay there. And that's what I mean about furniture being so foundational to human existence. Among those, I found some really interesting furniture makers. Philo Harbison does not have a piece of furniture that we know is existent still. But in Morganton, he was an African-American carver and furniture maker who was very important to that furniture tradition before the factories came. He, along with a lot of other people, I think of Thomas Day, but Thomas Day never made any furniture in Western North Carolina. The Historical Association of Cobb County has one of his pieces, but all of these personalities began to emerge for me as I studied the old days, and that's the first couple of chapters of the book. I think I got 35 chapters in this thing, and it just kept expanding as I would go through it. The publisher that I'm part of, publishing group through Catawba Valley Community College, said, well, you need to take about 600 pages to tell the story. And I pushed that to 660 because I just kept finding really good stories. Leroy would introduce me to somebody who would introduce me to somebody else. And, it became a period I finally had to say in the early part of 2023, I got to stop. Now, I probably missed some stuff as a result of that, because you know how people are. They'll come up to you and go, did you have this company? And sometimes I do, sometimes I don't, because there's just so many stories to tell there that there'll be a volume 2. But how furniture, our first factory, in my opinion, is not in Mebane. What I found through research was there was a furniture dealer in Charlotte by the name of Daniel A. Smith who decided that he wanted to make furniture on his own. And he went to the westernmost place that he could get the wood he needed, and that was Old Fort, because the railroad had not been finished all the way to Asheville at that point. And so in 1875, predating Mebane, white furniture, by 6 years, D.A. Smith builds a furniture factory. And the way I found this was through the fact that there was a furniture company in Morganton that burnt to the ground in 1886. That company began as the D.A. Smith Company. He sold it to Major Wilson, who was president of the Western North Carolina Railroad, who wanted it for his son. And after that, it went nowhere. Now, Lenoir is the next place. And Lenoir and Morganton kind of vie for this, who built the first furniture factory in North Carolina, or in Western North Carolina. You could say Morganton because of the Old Fort factory. But since that burned to the ground, it doesn't have a continuing tradition. Lenoir does. And Lenoir is a great example of what was going on in the post-Civil War era, in that it was a time when the South was looking for its identity. And a guy like Henry Grady comes along and says, well, we need a new South. We need the South to get with industrializing. And so you read it in Morganton papers, in the Morganton Blade, you read it in the Lenoir Topic, of editors and people writing letters to the paper that says, this town needs an industry. And with Lenoir, it became a subscription furniture company. I mean, the guy that wrote, W.W. Scott, would not relent on his readers. I mean, he said, I hope you don't sleep at night if you don't subscribe to this company. He first started with a canning factory, that was a broom factory idea for a while, and finally he hits on furniture. And what furniture becomes is that identity that they were looking for. Now, they were never fully subscribed. I mean, they never had enough money to get them through the lean times, and that's why the Lenoir Furniture Factory kind of lopes along from March of 1889 until around 1900 before it gets on its footing. It becomes one of those factories like we see from time to time that gets sold or leased out at least 4 times to other interests who try to run it. Some of them from High Point, Chris Brothers. There's a Philadelphia syndicate that tries to run it for a while, but it really never gets on a footing until the guy who really helped start it, Major G.W.F. Harper, he decides to lease the furniture factory. And then it begins steady production, because for a while it would run for a few weeks and then it wouldn't. You had all kinds of issues of them being able to handle it. So the Lenore topic with Scott, you see it right here. We're going to have a furniture factory. He's jubilant. That enthusiasm is not met by its production, but in that era, a lot of towns were, number one, looking for identity. Number two, had excess labor, people that didn't have anything to do. And they just needed the capitalization. Harper provided that. And he also had a guy that would eventually become his son-in-law. You may have heard of at least the last name, John Matthias Bernhardt, who was the original president of the company. He'd spent a few years out in Oregon amongst the trees, so he knew wood better than anybody else. And so Bernhardt, there it is going to be the president of this company for about a year. He's going to go back into lumber, logging, eventually start a box factory, and then come back into furniture as a company right around the time of the war. But here's an image of them they were very excited about this, bringing the boiler to town. This was the Harper business in Lenore that is going to retail some of that furniture. And it lopes along for that 10, 11 year period without real success. They have to continue to put money into it. One time they call for a board meeting and they don't even get enough people to show up to have a quorum. So it's a spotty history, we'll call it. But Lenore becomes a factory town, and very proud of it, even though they can't claim it was a success. And Lenore is one of those pillars of the West. They lease it out, as I mentioned before. So you've got Morganton that started, had it burned. Lenore, not that successful a factory. Then you've also got Hickory that comes along. Now, in telling history, we know that there are different ways to get your information. Some of them is quantitative-based, factual. Some of it are stories that are handed down. And I can't say that this story is actually factual, but it's a good story. And that is the fact that George W. Hall is credited as the father of furniture in Hickory, because one day, if you've ever been to Hickory, you know the fact that the railroad made the town. That if you go to downtown Hickory, you're going to have to cross some railroad tracks, because all the businesses face the railroad. In 1861, that's when the railroad came through, right about the time of the war. It didn't reach Morganton, and so Hickory was a booster city. It was allowed to grow. And he was there at his store, saw a train come through that had logs on it. And he thought, those logs are probably going to the established furniture capital of the United States at the time, Grand Rapids. We might sell that wood to Grand Rapids, and then they sell it back to us as furniture, value added, that kind of thing. And he thought, why don't we have a factory here and we keep that money? And that's how he gets known as the father of the furniture industry. There he is right there. And Hickory Manufacturing, as a result of his efforts, comes into being. Sometimes you're just lucky, because in addition to that, you also have T.J. Martin coming up from South Carolina that starts another factory, and they share the side tracks. One makes bedroom, one makes living room furniture, and it was a symbiosis that worked. The only thing they didn't have was a chair factory. And they'll recruit that. We think of towns recruiting businesses as a later day phenomenon. They were doing that back turn of the century in the 19-teens. You also have Statesville here. Statesville's an interesting story in that the Key family made distilled whiskey, but a religious conversion stopped all that, and they moved over to the furniture business. So many different ways that these companies are coming together. But that 1901 to 03 time was extremely pivotal because that's when you began to see more companies established. Drexel's going to be a good example. Sam Huffman didn't want to pay the taxes in Morganton, so he located outside of Morganton in the wilderness and came up with the name of the town, thought Drexel sounded, substantial, classy, and from the Drexel family in Philadelphia. So he named his factory that, and now there's a town that grew up around it, which shows what it adds to the economy. Despite the fact that they had fires in 1905, 06, 012, Morganton Fire Department really couldn't help them. He was willing to brave that in order to create for himself a factory where he made the decisions about what went on there. So you get a number of companies that come along after, and now we've got something. We've got an industry. We've got a group of companies here, just like you also had in High Point, but a group of companies in western North Carolina that are producing the same thing. Sure, they're competitors, but they are also cooperating with each other. There was a Broyhill, Bernhardt, and Harper, which eventually becomes, goes into Fairfield. I think it's a bedroom suit that is made by, components of it are made by all three. And so it shows the cooperation that you have between them. One of the interesting things about Drexel is the turnover there in a very short period of time between, from Sam Huffman through what eventually becomes his youngest son, R.O. Huffman, to take control, because that's always an issue. But that 01 to 03 period really establishes its own industry in western North Carolina. We got something to talk about at that point. I love this story about Pat Petit, that this is the mechanized era I think it's in the 30s, when he's driving a truck, stops off for a beer. Huffman sees him, is shocked that one of his employees would drink beer during work hours, fires him, finds out they have nobody to drive the truck, hires him back. When he gets to his destination, it's a plant in Marion, he fires him again, but realizes nobody can run a stick shift, so he has to hire him back. Now, Pat Petit goes on to become mayor of Drexel. But it's those kinds of fun stories, it's kind of like Frank the Horse I had earlier, that tell the story of the furniture industry because of the people. And when I was a kid in the factory, it was really the people that created that culture, that family that you had there, that I think adds a really interesting element to furniture beyond what companies started when, and what they made, and when they went out of business, and all that sort of thing. So the early part of the century is a very formative time for furniture in western North Carolina. As we go through the war, we've got a number of stories. One is about a man who started a sawmill. He was in a family of, I think he had five brothers, yeah. And he is going to use the technology of the era in order to get himself into the furniture business. His name is Tom Broyhill. And what he has is this sawmill that is powered by a steam engine. So he could drag that engine all the way to where the wood is sawed down. Instead of dragging that huge trunk out of the wilderness, he's going to saw it up there and makes the process easier. He supplies wood for the Kent Furniture Company that was started by Dr. Kent, who was a real kind of forward thinker, right not too long after the turn of the century. Because that company is not particularly solvent, they can't pay him for the wood, so they give him a 4% stake in the company. That eventually grows to the point that Tom Broyhill owns Kent Furniture and renames it the Lenore Furniture Corporation. He also has a younger brother who is an enterprising sort, who grew up under Tom's tutelage, worked in his sawmills and that sort of thing, named J.E. or Ed Broyhill. Ed's going to be 12 years younger than Tom. Ed's going to go to Appalachian State Teachers College, now known as Appalachian State University, and is going to serve in World War I, has typing skills. When he comes back, he goes to work for his older brother. His older brother doesn't pay him. In other words, he never gets a check from the Lenore Furniture Corporation. But at the end of the year, he gets a bonus and a stake in the company. So that by the 1920s, Ed is going to create his own company, Lenore Chair, in the basement of his house. Doesn't take long for him to outgrow that, but now you've got two Broyhills out there. But this is an interesting relationship that I think we see in that the two brothers work well together. Tom is, I think, much more interested in playing golf. That's why he builds a golf course across the street from his house. And retiring, at the time, Ed is ramping up and wanting to make his mark in business. And so Ed Broyhill, eventually by 1940, these two Broyhill companies become one as Broyhill Furniture Industries. And Ed takes over and begins to move the business forward. That's how you get the Broyhills. And the Broyhills were so ubiquitous in Lenore. I mean, just about everything is named for the Broyhills. Because while most of these furniture companies don't pay their workers very well, there is this, let's call it community welfare that goes on, in that the Broyhills know the people who work for them and know their family situation. So if they're in need, they help out. At Christmas, they put on the dog. There's things that they do for the community that you don't see later once the family is out of the business. So there's all these things that furniture helps in Western North Carolina. There's a mirror factory. They come up from High Point. The relationship is still there between High Point and Hickory in that I think there was a mention of it in one of those slides about a guy who becomes this kind of furniture superstar, and the Lenore companies, no, it's Statesville first, hires him away from High Point. So we're stealing workers from High Point is stealing workers from us. It becomes a bit of a rivalry. Now in 21, that's when High Point establishes its furniture market. And you see all of these Western manufacturers bring their stuff down. And that exists for about 30 years until the Western manufacturers say, we should establish our own. And that's when you get the real competition between Hickory and High Point. If you were around during the furniture market, it starts small in Hickory, but if you were around in the 70s, you couldn't get a motel room in Hickory during April, and there's 10 days in April and October that we're in now. You couldn't get a reservation at a restaurant. The roads were clogged. It was just kind of chaos. You knew to stay out of Hickory during market. But when Hickory started its furniture market, it started in very humble circumstances, as all of these things did. The furniture market started on a basketball floor at a building that's still there today. One of the things they like to crow about is the fact that the local college, Lenore Ryan, in 1948 beat Carolina in basketball. But on that same floor, you had these wire-strung bed sheets between the display areas, and that's how the Hickory furniture market began. That was 53. So that began as the heyday for it, but I'm getting ahead of myself. I love downstairs the way you show the progression of a piece of furniture. I would love for students of furniture to see that, because there we go. That shows the craftsmanship that went into making so many of these pieces. Although Southern furniture was not always regarded as being the best furniture. Grand Rapids had that reputation of that's where your finest furniture was made. And I learned of two jokes about Southern furniture. They call it borax. And if you remember the 20 Mule Team borax, it was soap. And you got a glass or a cup or something in it. But it suggested that it was of lesser quality. And the two jokes are this. One was, well, let me tell the second one first. A person, it was a lady who lived in Hickory who bought her furniture through the Sears and Roebuck catalog. And when she found out it was made in Hickory, she refused delivery of it. The second one was a furniture retailer, a store owner, writes a letter to the furniture company and says, got your shipment, have the furniture in the crate in which it came, which do I put on display? And in a snarky way, the furniture manufacturer wrote back to him and said, put them both in the window and order more, which sells. But that was the whole knock against Southern furniture was that it was borax. It was made with gum wood sometimes. It needed veneer to cover up the mistakes or the lack of quality. But one of the things a furniture manufacturer told me, it's actually his son, he said that his father, who had this $1 million mansion, would have the cheapest furniture his furniture company made because he wanted furniture that everybody could buy. And the price point, you know how in furniture you've got kind of like 3 lines, basic lines. You've got your high end, you've got your middle range, and then you've got your low end. Western North Carolina, except for Drexel, who did the strangest thing I can imagine, that during the Depression created a high line furniture, a high line of furniture. What is the name of that? Tourette, I think it was Tourette. Zigged when everybody else was zagging. But I think that's one of the interesting things you see about this industry is how they have kind of gone their own way and at times went against the, pardon this pun, the grain of what was going on. J.E. Broyhill is another great example. During the Depression, when you had furniture companies going out of business, that's when J.E. said to his brother, we should co-invest in some of these factories that have gone defunct. Now, his older brother Tom, who's getting closer to retirement, didn't really want to do that. And sometimes he would overrule J.E. and say no, but that's how Broyhill got to be in Rutherford County, in McDowell County, in Catawba County, and expanded their operation because they were buying when everybody else was selling. So there's so many different stories about this. I thought it was very important that we collect them because especially for us on the western end, there's not been a book that has detailed furniture specifically. There's county histories, there's histories of the Van Noppen book of the region that talks about furniture in small detail. And I pulled from those where I could. But there was so much more in terms of the story of furniture in Western North Carolina that really had to be told, and that's why, there's borax. And that gives you an idea of what some of that furniture looked like. That's actually from the Hickory Furniture Mart Furniture Museum that they had. So there were so many stories about this that really needed to be told, and while I don't have every manufacturer there, I tried to get the ones who epitomize what was going on in the industry at the time. Another example, and it may have already shown up here. Wishmaker House, that's the one. You get, and it's funny, when I was in this museum, it reminded me of, there's several competitions that go on between High Point and Hickory. One is Thomas Bus, and you got a very nice display there. But we had our own bus maker too. It was Bolex buses. And it began as a buggy manufacturer. And the creator of it was Oscar Bolex. He put his son, Jerome Bolex, he put his son Oscar in charge of the seats in the wagons and the buggies that he made. And Jerome expected his son to be part of this, before mechanization, wagon maker. But Oscar decided he wanted to concentrate on seating and that sort of thing, and so he started his own furniture company. And the building that he began it in is still there on the border between Conover and Newton. You can drive by there. There's a sign that has you can't go in, but it's a stone building that's still there. Anyway, Oscar would make a few pieces of furniture, and actually one of the people that helped him was one of Leroy's grandfathers. He would make those pieces of furniture. He would take them on the road, sell them, shut the factory down, sell them, go back and make a few more. And it epitomizes the way a lot of these companies began. J.E. Broyhill in his basement, Oscar Bolex in this stone building. I talked to a salesman who was a great source of information. His father started a furniture company in his garage out back. Now, he said one of the reasons his father wasn't successful as a furniture manufacturer was because he sold to people who didn't pay him, and he just didn't have the heart to put the pressure on to collect. So he went back to sales. But what Hank Ruhlman told me was he watched his father go into a furniture company, a furniture retailer in Florida, make a sale. And when he came out of there, he asked his father, well, how much did you make? The father gave him a number that was equivalent to what it took his friend's father's 2 weeks to make. And so he decided, wow, sales is for me, because he didn't break a sweat. He went in, he slapped the back with the furniture retailer and had a conversation. They had a handshake deal, ba-bing. The commission of it was enough to supply the family with the same kind of funds his friends' fathers had to work 2 weeks to get. So all of these stories, I think, combined give us a picture of what furniture manufacturing was. And it wasn't always easy. If you look at the era coming in, the Depression, for a lot of companies, they went out of business, or else they filled up their warehouse by having their workers work for furniture that wasn't selling, which sometimes they could weather, sometimes they couldn't. You had so many different stories of what it was like. Then you come to the Second World War, which really, as we all know, is what fully ended the Depression. Because when you got on a war footing, you're making war material, and not for a consumer market that was or wasn't buying it. World War II was a great period for especially Western North Carolina furniture manufacturers. You look at Drexel, they made General MacArthur's desk, put his name on it, aggrandizing MacArthur in a way that MacArthur liked. You also had furniture for barracks, as they were using it for training. There were so many different ways that the government would put furniture as part of its war effort. And the same thing happened during World War I. They were almost at the point that they were going to outlaw the production of bedroom furniture, because the War Production Board in World War I said everything really needs to go for the war effort. They were at the point, in January of 1919, they were going to outlaw consumer production of bedroom furniture. Don't need it, we need to concentrate on the war. Well, what do we know about January 19th? The war's over in November of 18, so therefore that never went into effect, and therefore these companies could retool and go back to that consumer market because the war's over. You never see that with World War II, but what you do see is the same thing you see in so many industries. They had orders for furniture, and they had fewer people to make them because the men were in large number off to fight. And so the factories were filled by women, no different than any other industry. What's also no different is that after World War I, most of these women went back into the home. After World War II, a lot of them didn't. But there's still that lag between the between the end of the war, when you're making things, and the government even sued Spainauer Furniture up here because they had Spainauer had a rise in the price of their wood that it took to fill this government order. They went back to the government and said, we need to renegotiate the price because we're not making any money when you're buying this stuff from us. The government said no and sued them. Now I don't need to tell you about government waste and that sort of stuff. You've seen it in our lifetimes. But the government sued them. It cost the government significantly more to sue them and get their money from the company than it would have been just to pay the higher price and go on. But that's the way it goes. After World War II, I wanted to include as many women, because they're kind of hidden from us, as many women as possible into the furniture business. And Helen Kelly was a great example in that she was a teacher for a while. She was she sold on the showroom floor of a retail business, but she became a designer for furniture that we don't see very many of. And so every time I came across a woman in the furniture business, I needed to dig down deeper to help tell their story. There's so many stories of people coming along after World War II. They used to say that Hickory Chair was the grandfather of so many companies because, and Leroy confirmed this for me, he said that you would have more companies created in a cocktail party than you would in a boardroom. Because you get two salesmen coming together, a lot of them learning their trade at Hickory Chair, and decide, we can do this. And they would find a production person and they began a company. Some of those lasted, some of them didn't, but it still speaks to the entrepreneurial spirit and kind of the can-do attitude that you see from so many furniture manufacturers. You also have $8 more, the government sues, pays $8 more than the price, than the revised price, but that's a small pittance compared to what it costs the government to engage in that suit. You see furniture changing over the years. You see early American was always a star. I used to think there was nothing made other than early American furniture because that's what my mother always wanted to buy. But you have these modern styles, some of them, especially kind of the Kent coffee stuff, that if you look online, it's going for a much higher price than you would think it would. Hank Ruhlman was the salesman I was talking about. He talked about turning a flip one time. He got such a big order from a furniture company. I mean, a handstand flip, that sort of thing. He was so excited about it. All of those go together to really suggest that the 50s and 60s were the real heyday of furniture production in Western North Carolina, because that's when it's going its best. But there ends up being a bit of a snake in the garden. And that is, after Drexel consolidates its business with Drexel Industries, it sells out to Champion Paper. Now you've got a new overlord in town, a company that has decided that it needs to diversify. A paper manufacturer that owns a furniture company. But in that era in American business, that was part and parcel of what tended to go on. You needed to have companies that you had no connection with, so that if one sector goes down, the other one might be going up, and you cut your losses that way. In 1967, Fortune magazine does an article on Southern furniture, and it eviscerates us. High Point, Western North Carolina. Who they were particularly tough on was Bassett and Bassett, Virginia. Because if you read that article, you would get the idea that none of us know what we're doing. It was second generation furniture owners, the sons of the original owners, and that was it said to other companies throughout the United States, these people don't know what they're doing, but yet they're making a lot of money. So you had calls that start, and interest by large corporations in these smaller furniture companies. Alex Bernhardt used to say he would get at least several calls a week, people wanting to buy his family-owned company. Now, as we know, Bernhardt is still a family-owned company, so they weathered those calls, but a lot of companies didn't. Broyhill, for example, did not. In 1980, they sold to a shoe manufacturer because of that diversification. But what's different, and this is something I used to see when I was a kid on the back, and I found one, so I took a picture of it. Furniture capital of the world, Lenore? Really? But that was the competition between Hickory and Lenore and Morganton and High Point that went on until High Point laid the punch that knocked that trio of cities out in about 1985, which is when that ended once and for all. Nell Burns, she actually owned a furniture company in Cox Manufacturing in Hickory. Her and her sister ran it successfully. So there's good stories out there that I put in the book. Once you begin to have corporate buyouts, then you begin to have ownership that is much more focused on the cost of the employees. And that hurts. And then you get to the 70s, bad economic times, the 80s, you begin that era of shutdowns or short weeks where people are only working for a week, then they're off a week so they can sign up for unemployment, then they're back a week and that sort of thing. And it continues to go on. You add to that things like outsourcing, offshoring. That becomes another issue that is going to hurt Western North Carolina furniture. Now, one of the things Leroy did that I think was incredibly smart is he had this, he started with his father-in-law's 6,000 square foot basement of his restaurant that was the Hickory Furniture Mart. Leroy would after he came back from the Navy and from he was an ROTC guy from Chapel Hill, went to Chapel Hill. When he came back, he took that 6,000 square feet facility and enlarged it. And between furniture markets, he would enlarge every time. And I asked him one time, I said, well, did you ever do that on spec? That you're borrowing money to add to this? And he looked at me like I'd fallen out of a tree. No, we would never do that. And he would add on to the point that now the Hickory Furniture Mart is 800,000 square feet. So he was looking for all sorts of ways in which he could use that facility between April and October. He would invite the public in, come see what, and buy the samples. He would have all sorts of things going on. But when the end came, he would even have people bring buses down to High Point when the market was here, to bring people up to Hickory, to make it as easy as possible. What he told me was, what they began to notice, and the facts, the numbers bear this out, was that people would come to High Point. And then they would come up to Hickory for a day, see stuff they liked. But then they might go back to High Point, and instead of coming back up here and getting, and offering getting the order, or giving the order, they would find something comparable in High Point, which hurt Hickory. But what Leroy was able to do was to figure out a way to adaptively reuse the Hickory Furniture Mart. And for a couple of years, he had a design center in there. He would offer a show for furniture companies, so that people who offered, knobs and finishes and that sort of stuff could come in for an industry work, expo kind of thing. But where we hit the real idea is to turn it into an outlet and create Hickory Furniture Mart, so that he had people eventually. There was a plane of like 113 people that would come from Michigan, fly in for the day, make their furniture purchases, and then fly back out. Heads of countries, of foreign countries, especially in the Middle East, would come over and shop there. One of them, I think, bought about $300,000 worth of furniture. So he refigured, he got handed lemons when the furniture market left, and he turned it into a pretty sweet lemonade that still is no longer in use for those 20 days of the year. They're in use for 360 days. And if you go there on any given day, the parking lot's full, especially when you get to the spring and summer, as people are coming and buying. Over the years, there's been a lot of different styles, and they have kept up. And one of the things the Hickory Furniture Mart now is offers all of those. You also see I guess you would call it the educationalizing of furniture, with NC State offering a furniture degree. One of my colleagues at CVCC went through this program, and he taught furniture design and production at CVCC, because what we offered was a bit of a different version of that. NC State was for your designers, your engineers, what State is known for. Ours was much more for the folks on the floor. And so CVCC, for a number of years, has had a furniture degree that is mainly for workers. There's some backlash to that on the part of the manufacturers themselves. Like in this newsletter, Lloyd Hyder is saying, well, does everybody need a degree? If they do, we don't have any workers anymore. But what we're trying to do is produce better workers. Now, when the furniture market left Hickory, you get the local folks there say, well, we need to figure out what our specialty is. And they decided on upholstery as being the example. And so we, for a while, CVCC shut down its furniture program because we just didn't have anybody coming through there. Those were the bad days of 10% unemployment in Catawba County, and we didn't see that, we didn't have any people coming through. It has been reimagined, thanks to our president, as the Hickory Furniture Academy. We've taken over a building that was, I think it was Hickory Leather, I may not have the name on it, Old Hickory Leather, I think it is, and have created a new furniture academy that all of our students are going out to the furniture factories. In other words, we have 100% what do you call that, when you hire people from the program, 100% infiltration, let's call it, into the furniture industry, and they're wanting more. You know, we can't create it as fast as, create these workers as fast as the industry needs them in the area. Because there has been a change. Instead of workers being considered unskilled and paying them at minimum wage, what you see with a new generation of companies is they begin to value those workers because they're the ones who are going to make the product they need. And at the end of the book, originally when I conceived the idea of this book, back in grad school, because this is what I wrote on for my master's thesis, I was going to look at it as a bit of a Greek tragedy, in that you look at the rise and the fall of the furniture industry. In many ways, it's a lot like Piedmont Airlines. You know, you had the heyday of the airline, and when they sell to U.S. Air, it just falls to the ground. But in waiting, between the time that I got my degree and 2019, when I started on this book, there has been enough of a resurgence to talk about it coming back. And that whole new view of the worker as not an unskilled person, but as an investment for these companies, has really fueled a different attitude that you see in some of our best and most productive companies in Western North Carolina. Folks like McCrary Modern, folks like Wesley Hall, who has a brother and sister who are 5th generation furniture. I think one of them's in their early 30s, the other one's right around 30, that are very bullish on furniture. Lee Industries, who made their name as being environmentally responsible. All of these companies are creating for themselves a new niche that I think is going to take us well through the 21st century in terms of our continuation of furniture there. But it's a long twisty path that furniture has been through. And, you know, I look at High Point as kind of the yin to our yang, because I don't think one could exist without the other. When it first started, High Point had the Uwharrie Mountains as a source of wood, although both have gone far and wide from where they started. There were log flumes that John Matthias Bernhardt was creating in the mountains of North Carolina in the brushy chain that would float that wood down. The furniture industry, as I define it from my experience on the western side, has been very adaptive. Hasn't always been good days. I mean, the governor sent his folks up. This was when Governor Hunt was at the head of North Carolina. Sent his people up when Singer Furniture shut down, and there were like 700 people that didn't have a job right before Christmas. So it's been tough, and it's required the industry to rethink itself, because you can't buy McCrary Modern Furniture. They don't make a line under their own name. What they do is they make lines for other companies. Mitchell Gold is another one. And his company has recently gone through some interesting times in that they shut it down. But I was at a Rotary Club meeting we did on furniture back, I guess about a month ago, where he was saying that he hopes to have another investor group that is going to restart it. Because think about what Mitchell Gold did for that county in 1989 when he started, Alexander County, when he started his company. He not only paid his workers better, he created a daycare center for them. He has, the joke is, he came into looking to buy this factory and said, well, when do you guys turn on the air conditioning? And they laughed at it and said, there's no air conditioning in a furniture factory. He put it in. You know, the daycare center allowed his workers a place to put, for their kids, a good place, so that they could be there. He's got nurses on staff that are there for health care for his workers. He really is kind of, in my opinion, the pioneer of reimagining what a furniture factory could be for its workers. And when I was talking about Southern furniture with Jerome Bolick, that's another example of a different way that it goes, because in 2018 it was sold to a Chinese company, Craftmaster. The Chinese company had already bought Craftmaster, and then they bought Southern. So now they have two factories here. People figured that it was just a way in which they could steal the nameplate and take furniture production to China, part of that offshoring thing. But what they found out was that, given the economic times, it made more sense for them to invest in a Stony Point company, Stony Point being in Alexander County near Taylorsville, between Taylorsville and Statesville, than it was to just take everything offshore. Because there were all these stories about how furniture wasn't working when it was made in China. I got a really good story from a friend who said her husband was in a warehouse one day and he kept hearing this popping and cracking. And he couldn't figure out what it was until finally it dawned on him. He went and got the president of the company, who wasn't happy to be drugged down to the warehouse, and said, "Well, what is it?" He said, "Just listen." And they stood there, and there we go. What it was because of the quality of the glue used on the veneer of furniture that was produced in China, it was popping off the furniture. And quality control was not what they wanted it to be. And so they had to rethink the whole thing. And I think that's what has happened in the last 20 years to allow me to tell a rise, fall, and rebirth story. That, number one, it didn't help to put all these people out of work who were no longer your customers, a la Henry Ford with his Model T. I mean, he did the same thing. But also that you gain quality control over a product that's got in some cases, your name on it, that you didn't have when you're offshoring it, no matter how much money you're saving as far as labor goes. So all of these items, and as well as ones here that I kind of rolled through, because where this comes from was when I was writing the book, I would go to the local library and tell a piece of this story once a month for like 7 months. And what that gave me was an opportunity to road test the book and get people to weigh in. Because one of the things I've noticed about with other stuff I've wrote is that you tell this story kind of in isolation, and then when you take it out to the public has feedback. And if you've already got the book published, you don't have the opportunity for the feedback. But if you take it out and road test it, you're going to get stories, and they're going to say, "Well, that's true, but," and you color your story in a different way. So that's why I wanted to just kind of go through the story piece by piece and talk about these various things. It's like in this case, Hickory Springs. There was a gentleman who was president of Hickory Springs that I got to talk to who said, "We found it economical for us to build our factories right next to a furniture company if we could get the land. Because if they're buying from us, we're making more than enough money to fabricate a building. And within that building, we are servicing that company. They like it because we're closer." And so it's that kind of ingenious change that you see in terms of the furniture industry adapting itself for whatever it needs to make it work. As the intercut. And the other sad thing about the corporatization is that, and I don't try not to make them a bad guy, but I think their actions speak for themselves. When these companies come along, that the furniture they make may or may not be as good. The way workers are treated is generally not as good, and it kind of is almost like karma, in my opinion, that the company that owned Broyhill eventually owned Drexel too. I mean, they were all in the same family. Furniture Brands International had a person, when one of these factories shut down in Lenore and put all these people out of a job, said, in my opinion, rather callously, "We're not closing factories fast enough." I mean, that really. And there was a guy who had a used car business, and one of the quotes from him is, "They're slowly killing the town," because all of the, Lenore was so proud of its furniture manufacturing. Hickory had somewhat diversified. We had fiber optics and hosiery and textiles in Hickory, so it wasn't as big a blow. But when Lenore lost those, it was devastating. And so not only, when Broyhill sells out, or when Kincaid sells out, and all of them, they shut these factories down, you not only lose the workers there, you begin to lose workers at the restaurants where they go to at lunch. The convenience store across the street from Kincaid's main plant, clothing stores, all of these things that depended upon furniture workers having money in their pocket to buy things goes away. And so much of little places like Joyston that had Hammery furniture and Kincaid is just dried up. Now it's slowly coming back, but it really, really devastated a lot of the small towns that grew up because they were there to service the furniture factory. That's what Singer looks like these days. I took that picture because it kind of epitomizes for me what has happened, and that factory has never come back. It's there right for the reimagining. But when Magnavox bought 4 furniture companies and consolidated them together, and Magnavox was buying in the early 70s or late 60s, they then got bought out by Singer, who did run it for 25 years, but you can see what happened. Drexel and Hendredon went from competitors. Hendredon is, I love the way furniture companies get their names sometimes. Henry, oh man, it just eludes me now.
They know, somebody in here knows.
Will, yes. Say that again.
Van Oppen.
Yeah, the Van Oppen.
Wilson.
But it was a smash up of the names. Kind of like Hammery. Ham Bruce, who was a furniture glue salesman and varnish, started a company, come to Lenore, started a company with his wife Mary, so it became Hammery. So you get all these kind of inventive ways in which these companies come into being. And Hammery, it made me think of it because Hammery was one of those ones in Joyston along with Kincaid. There's there's whole books been written about how to shop these places, these buyer's guides. So there's a recrafting that has gone on that gives me real hope for furniture. There's that whole in the 90s and 2000s, the designer lines. It shows people coming up with different ways in which they could market their product that their fathers or grandfathers didn't. Probably back in here that you saw, there was that whole love affair they had with plastics. So I got a whole chapter on the love of plastic, because that was a kind of a weird phenomenon of the late 60s and early 70s that mercifully they got away from. But it was rethinking it. It was all the time coming up with ways, that's the FBI, and IHF, that's the, and these are maybe current pictures from when I was writing the book of kind of what it's turned into. Yeah, the Drexel plant in Morganton is now just it looks like it's gone through a war because they tore the factory down, both in Drexel and Morganton. I went to a couple of years ago. I went to a banquet at one of the furniture markets and met somebody that says they knew John Chipperfield. I forget his first name, but there was this dollars and cents approach to furniture that you didn't see from earlier eras, and I think the furniture industry was suffered as a result of it. So, in writing the book, it's compendium, it's not an encyclopedia. It really is wanting to tell that fluid story of its rise, its fall, its re-rise, and kind of give the Western end an identity that I don't think it had. I don't think it had prior to it. That is not to infringe upon the reputation of High Point. Obviously, High Point is considered by the rest of the nation as the furniture capital of the world, although that's being challenged because the High Point market, there's now markets in LA, Dallas, Las Vegas, But there kind of always was. You know, in the early days it was Chicago and New York that High Point went on to challenge. But in that kind of 100 years now of the High Point furniture market, it's established itself to the point that it vanquished Hickory. And now, you know, when Bernhardt came here and said, we're not going to show in Hickory, we're going to show here, that was sort of that was the death knell. But the area has made every attempt to keep itself relevant. Before Leroy passed, he was wanting to do a small furniture Hall of Fame thing in the Hickory Metro Hickory Metro Convention Center, which he helped create. So there's ways in which the Western End represents itself. I just wanted to make sure that culture, that contribution didn't die. So.